We're going to talk about the untold psychology of Anhedonia. My name is Marco Sander. I'm a German psychologist and licensed psychotherapist. And I watched a couple of videos on YouTube, also listening to some smart psychologists and psychotherapists talking about this topic, but they're always hitting it from one angle, which is a very cognitive one. They talk about the neuroscience behind the pathways, the lack of dopamine, hedonic adaptation, and all kind of smart concepts, and they're all correct. But there's one point you're missing. Anhedonia is basically a feeling. So you gotta understand this on a feeling level and not just on a cognitive, neuroscientific level and explaining that. That perspective is correct, but it's not really helping it to resolve it. Let's start with the definition. Anhedonia is basically the lack of pleasure. You kind of like feel a little empty, it feels a little dull. Some people refer to it even as like some sort of white depression. It's like lack of purpose. And it's not really joyful anymore. You're still functioning though, right? You still do things, maybe you exercise, you go to your job, maybe you meet your friends, like you still do stuff. So basically you're functioning, but there's not much joy. Even in activities that maybe used to be joyful for you and just feels a little dull. Now, the core aspect here is lacking meaning. And in psychology, and also if I do coaching sessions, even psychotherapy sessions, I often take a closer look with my clients regarding their childhood. In the beginning, sometimes this doesn't make sense at all because they say, I had a happy childhood, everything was basically fine, there's nothing to look at. But over hours, sometimes we discover great gold. Here's an idea, an example of a client I worked with. The client, I'll just change the name, let's call him Tim. I'll basically change a lot of aspects here, but basically Tim, 30 years old. In the last 2 to 3 years, he's suffering from this anhedonia, nothing is really joyful. Before that, everything was kind of fine. He just pushed a lot, worked a lot on things and been super motivated about stuff. But the last 2 to 3 years, that was different. We took a closer look, and I just want to pick one example right here that was kind of like a representation of his childhood. So Tim was like 5 years old, he drew a picture and he showed it to his father. And his father quickly looked at it, he was kind of tired because his father worked a lot. The father gave Tim a compliment and said, oh, that's a nice picture, but just like a broad compliment that he didn't really mean from the bottom of his heart. And also Tim's father never really referred back to that picture. You know, he didn't remember it. A couple of days later, he didn't come back and be like, hey, I remember you drew this picture. Are you drawing something today? You know, there was not much involvement felt. And as a child, you create meaning if something is meaningful to others. You still do this as an adult, by the way, but if you notice, especially as a child, if something is meaningful to someone else, then it's also meaningful to me, and especially my father and my mother, who is supposed to love me in an unconditional way. And if you notice, I feel like drawing a picture. I kind of liked it. And I'm walking up to my dad, you know, with this feeling of like, damn, I'm going to show this to him. Like, hey dad, look what I drew. What do you think about it? And you notice he's kind of like not really involved. He doesn't really fully is like surprised. He's not there with me. He doesn't think about it a lot. He's not asking an additional question. He's kind of like forgetting about it. So you notice like my dad is not really into this, and you kind of like get this bummer feeling of, oh, then maybe it was not even worthwhile drawing it. And there was not one huge traumatic situation in his life. It was just basically, this was the atmosphere. Parents were kind of like uninvolved, not fully cared. And this is basically the origin of where things started to feel meaningless. Now, as a child, you have a lot of coping mechanisms. You still like thrive. As a child, you tend to be narcissistic in this way that you maybe think, oh, maybe that was me. Maybe I just drew a shitty picture. Maybe I just have to do a little more to impress my parents, and then you set the boundaries high. By the way, I actually want to quickly grab my laptop because I watched another video on Anhedonia, and the most liked comment was the following: shrinking my goals is a massive mindset change. I've lived my whole life expecting nothing but perfection from myself, so I've pretty much never gotten any pleasure from any progress that wasn't exceptional. And this is what I'm talking here. If your parents are uninvolved and they don't really show like this, that the things are meaningful that you're doing, as a child, you're in this sense narcissistic, that you think, oh, maybe I have to do more, maybe I have to perform better. And you start to have this perfectionism within you, always needing to do better, in the hope, subconsciously, that maybe at some point it's good enough. And you still have this hope as an adult, maybe then somebody comes around and really hugs me and is like, hey, you're good enough, and gives me this feeling that I never had in my entire life. And that's just going on subconsciously. Consciously, you just, have this perfectionist that you're walking around, and you also kind of notice it, and you notice I'm too hard on myself, but you don't really know why and can't really point it towards something. And that's the problem with anhedonia. Usually people are like, well, I never had a traumatic experience in my life. I don't know, everything was fine. I had normal parents. And people even think about like, yeah, maybe that's just me, maybe that's genetics, I'm maybe just not supposed to be happy. And then those beliefs also kick in, but there's a really good reason for that. And this is just one example here with Tim. The solution, by the way, is then over coaching and therapy sessions is to take a closer look, feel into that, discover more what happened. This specific situation, for example, that just popped up over sessions, potentially even like remembered things between sessions, because we're rolling things up, and then you reconnect to that actual feeling that as a child you didn't want to show, because you wanted to be perfect to your father and your mother and really make it right and finally get that love, so you couldn't really connect yourself to this feeling of disappointment, this feeling of loneliness, this feeling of sadness, of like, I'm so happy walking up with this picture and being so disappointed, and it seems like whatever I'm doing, whatever I'm drawing, this helplessness of like, I can't do anything that seems purposeful here. And maybe that's because of me, maybe I'm not love-worthy. Even though I enjoyed drawing, but it seems like it's not meaningful to others. And nowadays you start things that you're passionate about, but then at some point maybe you lose passion and it's not meaningful. And you have the same feeling as in your childhood, nothing makes sense, nothing is meaningful, whatever. You kind of like just walk through life just feeling, whatever. And the idea is to reconnect to that pain, to fully feel it. Because healing comes when you meet your wounded places with compassion. There are a lot of also exercises you can do, but basically connect with that feeling again, heal it, and be there with compassion. Potentially even get mad about your mother and your father not being so involved. That's sometimes part of that process, feeling. Maybe at first you feel very lighthearted of like, oh, it was never about me. This was just my father having a light depression as well and working way too much. It was not my mistake. Maybe then you get a little disappointed. Maybe then you get angry. And then at some point, maybe you even feel resentment. Maybe even the relationship with your parents is becoming less good over a period of time because you feel a lot of resentment that you never felt in your childhood. And then over time, again, maybe you feel more helplessness, more sadness, you cry over things, and especially in therapy and coaching sessions, the coach and the therapist is a good coach. He notices when emotions are coming up. He's stopping the client at the right moment. What happened just here? He's asking a question. The client talks rationally again. You'll know. Tell me about your feeling. What is going on there? And basically going through all those emotions at some point, there's this feeling of relief. And then at some point you naturally feel a little more life. Life feels a little more colorful. And maybe that is because of a similar situation and childhood as Tim had. Another example could be that your mother is simply depressed, and that's the same thing, uninvolved parent, depressed, and you always feel like you have to do something but it never works. Maybe you also feel like I have to connect to my mom and get down on her level and also be sad, and you never really allowed yourself to be so joyful because you maybe felt like I'm making my mother feel bad if I'm so joyful. And maybe you even feel guilt to live such an amazing life. So you kind of like always having this tall puppy syndrome, always like being just as good as others are, but never much better, because you would feel shame and guilt, and you got to let go of this guilt and basically emotionally let your mother there alone with her depression, because that's not your depression, it's not your negativity, it's your mom's negativity. You don't need to take this over. And there are tons of other examples how simply emotions spill over and get evolved and evoked in your childhood, and as an adult you're just like, well, I don't know, doesn't make sense, I just feel dull, well, that's just the way it is. And you're not even aware of how many feelings you can feel and how much depth and juice you can have on those emotions. That's my point. And that's the untold psychology. It is really the untold psychology that most people just figure out if they go to a psychotherapist and have those one-on-one sessions and they go deep and it stays in that room, you know, and not the majority of population actually understands what's actually going on, and that it's even treatable. Anhedonia is such a big topic. Therapy and coaching is something that really everybody should do multiple times throughout their life to really reflect and get to the core of where things are coming from. Things that you might not even notice that you have to cry still over them or have to work them out or have a bunch of emotions to go through, and transcend that in that way. All right, I hope that makes sense. If you're curious and if you notice, oh, maybe this makes sense, but I don't know, and maybe I want to give this a try, there's a link below the video. You can schedule a free call with me. We can just talk about the idea of working together. And otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.